Hoy tenemos el placer de traer a Justin G. Moore. Él es profesor en la Universidad de Columbia. Tuve el privilegio de trabajar en el curso que él impartía en esta universidad durante unos meses. De manera que lo primero que vamos a ver es su faceta docente en esta universidad, en la que se graduó en máster de arquitectura y en máster de ciencias de urbanismo y arquitectura. Asimismo vamos a ver la parte en la que trabaja a nivel de gestión, en la parte de administración, porque trabaja como en el departamento de planeamiento del Ayuntamiento de Nueva York, nada más y nada menos, donde ha trabajado como responsable de proyectos básicos de gran importancia que tienen lugar hoy en día en la transformación de Nueva York en la zona de Brooklyn, en la zona de Queens, en la zona de Greenpoint y Williamson. Y también vamos a ver su tercera faceta, que es como arquitecto y que tiene un sesgo de participación ciudadana. Trabaja mucho en comunidades para intentar regenerarlas a través de mantener el patrimonio arquitectónico, a través de recuperar zonas degradadas y activar con diseño comunitario a través de su Urban Patch, así como él lo llama, su propia oficina de la que es cofundador. Bueno, pues sin más, Justin, thank you very much for coming, and well, hope everybody is going to join and enjoy your presentation. Of course, it's going to be in English, and hope you enjoy this presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Jen. And first, apologies that I don't speak Spanish, so it's going to be an exercise. I'll try to speak slowly and translate. So I'm Justin Moore, as Jen introduced, and I met Jen originally when he was a visiting scholar with us at Columbia University, teaching in the urban design program, and he mentioned this 3-in-1 series. He mentioned this 3-in-1 series with the premise of looking at what one does professionally in architecture, but from different lenses. And I work as an urban designer and architect, and I do literally have 3 different sort of jobs and careers. One teaching with Columbia, one working in the city government as an urban designer, and one working with projects back home in Indianapolis, where I'm from, which is more of a grassroots and community-based approach to urbanism and design. So very often when I tell people, you know, I'm an architect, but what do I really do? I tell people that I make cities better, right? All of my work in some way is around trying to find ways to make cities and urban environments better. So I'm going to present sort of 3 different takes of that. The first, what I call think, which is the work that I do teaching at Columbia and around the idea of urban design as a discipline, right? So architecture very much has the ambition of changing environments for the better, but urban design takes in a lot of different aspects of that. And so in the Columbia program, we teach in a format that is interdisciplinary with different faculty, and we do a 3-semester program that includes looking at New York City, then expanding in the fall semester to look at a regional situation, and then the final semester they go to some other city in the world to look at the global context of the importance of cities in design. So I coordinate the fall studio of urban design, and we had architecture, landscape architecture, urban planning, economic development, historic preservation, faculty all working with 35 students who are from all over the world, 20 countries represented, that all come to New York City to study cities and how design can be a part of the improvement of cities. So the way that studio was structured is that we have independent research done by individual students, then group research that looks at cities across the U.S. and with the framework of understanding case studies of different cities and different topics, and then finally developing design proposals. So an important part of this exposure is for students to look across the country. So this is the U.S., New York here, but looking at cities like Savannah in the south, Laredo, which is a border city with Mexico, Denver in the mountains, and Portland on the west coast. And the idea is that looking at different contexts of different cities through the same lenses really helps students to learn and to understand how cities and regional perspectives are put together. So the result of some of that study and investigation really is getting the students to find what we call the common language of urban design. So looking at different urban systems, whether it's ecology, in this case in Laredo at the border of US and Mexico, there was a lot of discussion about economic controls, social controls, even crime, and how we sort of unpack those elements and those issues as they are design problems, right? Design research helps us to understand how we can design better. Other examples, this was some of the work from that studio looking at research in Denver and Colorado and the Colorado River Valley. So even though it's way at the center of the country in Colorado, this river valley is what feeds California, right? So if you think of Los Angeles and all of the kind of population that happens on the west coast, this is the origin of that water that serves that whole region. And so the impact of agricultural farming, all the meat that we eat in America, that pollution affects the water in California. And so the students were researching the impacts there. So again, this is research that is being done on what sort of impacts urban cities, and then bringing that back to our work in the Hudson River Valley, which New York City, Manhattan Island is here. Hudson Valley is the whole stretch of the river going north, and all of the network of cities and fabric, agricultural land, and landscape that is contributing to the health of New York City. So in that context, we worked in two cities, the city of Beacon and the city of Newburgh, which are about 1 hour north by drive from New York City. And these are cities that historically were very well positioned, but had a series of declines in economy as globalization and development happened. So we met, we brought our students and we met with stakeholders, site partners, residents of these cities to talk about the challenges and issues that we found in these two cities, upstate, and also have the students design interventions, projects, ways to engage with the public directly. So instead of only doing maps or only talking to other planners, designers, etc., the students designed a way to interface with the public. For example, making a Polaroid photo frame, staging it in the city to ask people what they think about the place or how they exchange. And this is information that was then sort of collected by the students in a way to inform their research and design. So the result of all of this was really in the studio in the format of what we're designing is to look at the definition of region as it relates to city and urban projects and ultimately design. And this is a quote from Lewis Mumford, who's a famous American urbanist. The short version I'll say is that the region, like its corresponding artifact, the city, is a collective work of art. So the definition of region isn't only political boundary or watershed, ecological boundary, but it's this sort of multiple layers of ideas and thinking that created this complex. So the students developed in their design research multiple different projects. I've just shown a sample here of 3 different projects where they've both defined region at one scale, but then ultimately grounded it into architectural proposals. So this is one project called AgriVenture that looked at the redesign of agricultural space in the Hudson River Valley around different programs, everything from education to extreme sports, adventure program that could then supplement the incomes of these small farms that were struggling in the kind of industrialized commodity agriculture systems to make them more sustainable. But ultimately, the design proposals of these students was to figure out what are the actual elements and armatures that were needed to then create this economy for the small scale. So this is an infrastructure that provides for transportation of people, tourists from New York City up into the farms, but also transportation of goods, allowing those small-scale farmers to bring their product to a broader market with all the infrastructure that they don't have from the large-scale agricultural corporate-controlled farms. This is a different proposal, again, a different definition of region, where they looked at the tourist economy. We call it the tourist shed of New York City. Billions and billions of dollars of tourists come into New York every year. You know, they go to Times Square, they go to Statue of Liberty. This proposal looked at extending that reach of the tourist into sort of the day trip or the two-day trip into the Hudson River Valley. And again, the design of an infrastructure to sort of capture using the existing transportation systems and the existing kind of cultural magnets that exist from art museums, farms, bed and breakfast, that type of thing, into the city, and finding a value capture that they could then anchor into those cities and to create local economy and jobs. And obviously this all anchors down into placemaking and sort of the architectural sort of transformation of a place to provide amenities. And this is a third proposal, which is looking at the movement of people and money, jobs, economy in the region. Again, New York City, major anchor, and finding out what are the networks of people's movements and activity that sort of could provide for jobs and economy. And ultimately, the design proposal looked at ways to use a material economy, the actual physical material of the city, in the design. So as a part of the studio, we have the students work very often in film to provide sort of a narrative construct for how the overall argument of a project is made, but also illustrating what the design impact of the ideas are. So again, large scale of region needs to be explored and questioned, but then how does that relate to people? So this is one example. This is footage from that on-site installation where the students got all of these issues from actually talking to people. This is the landscape there. A lot of historic buildings. So this proposal is looking at literally using the materials, vacant buildings, infrastructure as a way to train people that live in that community that has very high unemployment to sort of create jobs, higher skills that could then be deployed both in New York City but throughout the valley, and designing the infrastructure for how that creates a sort of a campus where people could gain skills and also to have distribution to that larger regional scale in the city. And in doing the research for this project, they went to a place in New York City called Material Connection, which is literally a materials library. So a place where people go to learn different materials, but then also there's a lot of relationship with corporate interests for kind of innovating materials and testing and experimenting. then this is the discussion for how that then sort of becomes a model that can reach to the regional scale of the city and of the Hudson Valley, so that you could have these sorts of models happening in other similar cities. And these were the students. So that's sort of the kind of scope of that type of student work. And again, these are sort of graduate students that had undergraduate architecture, landscape architecture, and they're unpacking and learning how urban scale and regional scale work can translate into design. Trying to advance. Okay. So the next scale of work that I'm going to show is a very different kind of approach, and this is from an organization called Urban Patch, which is a community-focused work on urban development that's very much from, I call it the low-budget grassroots scale. So this work is in Indianapolis. So this is a city in the Midwest of the United States. Chicago is probably the closest city that you would know of that's a few hours away. I don't know where that transition came from. So this is a dot density GIS map. So all the different colors are different demographics of people: white, black, Latino, and the concentration is the density, right? So Indianapolis, this pattern are literally all of the people in the city as a pattern. And so if you go into the inner city, kind of the heart of the city, you see this sort of mosaic of colors are all the different kind of demographics and conditions of people, which makes for a very rich urban environment. And this is very typical in the United States. Later on, I'll show you the New York version of this map to see where it gets even more intense. But this is the sort of the heart of the city and the place where we work. And this gentleman is my grandfather, and he worked in this same inner city in the 1940s. So during World War II, they had victory gardens, places where they would grow food to help with the war effort, because a lot of the food that was being done by industrial agriculture was being sent to the war effort. And so within the cities, and particularly in lower income communities, black communities, minority communities, they did not have access to food. And so my grandfather ran this program that had gardens at sort of one scale to teach people how to grow their own food. But he also ran a very large cooperative urban agriculture program. So this image is not a farm somewhere. This is actually inside of a city. So today there's a lot of projects around urban agriculture, all of these things. This is something that was being done way back in cities like Indianapolis. But not only did they do agriculture, they taught canning, they taught skills, cooking, nutrition things to people, and for the entire sort of set of the population, not only certain workers. This is a community center that they built. So again, in the United States at the time, a black community was not very well resourced by government or private interests. So this was something that they built themselves, and they had, a room this size, right, a demonstration kitchen to teach people how to cook and prepare food, and nutrition classes and health to deal with some of the health issues in the city. So what was really innovative about the work that this group did with my grandfather was they looked at the social construct of the urban community, of the neighborhood. So it wasn't, here's, low-income people or minority group that's not working. They took the time to actually map out what are the relations. So this is a sociogram, a social graph that they did back in the 1940s, where every dot is a family, and they networked what were the connections and bonds amongst those families to understand where there was capacity, where there's opportunity within the families to either get economic, social, or even material kind of aggregation of power, frankly. And so what they were able to do, they got a sort of a large grant, $100,000 at the time, which is like $1 million today, to create a working capital fund. So basically a big pot of money that they could then, throw it into this kind of social graph and sort of aggregate opportunities for the lower income people. So what they did with that was one of the first, what they called self-help housing programs, or sweat equity housing programs in the world at the time that was done at this scale. So they took this pot of money. The families would build the houses with their own equity using material from the working capital fund. And they built 300 of these in the neighborhood. So they had an architect gave sort of different template plans that could be customized by each family to their liking. And they developed the whole neighborhood. The working capital fund also paid for things like the sewers in that community. So the sort of the lesson from this was that this was a very low-income community, very low investment and power, but they were able to build their own neighborhood in 1940s United States, which is a pretty major thing. So Urban Patch, the project that I mentioned, is really sort of taking inspiration from all of this work and, again, simply taking the goal to make the city better. So this is a map of the inner city of Indianapolis. So the first map was the map of all the people. This map is a map of all of the decline, all of the bad things kind of happening at the urban scale. So anything that's red on this map is vacant property. Anything that's green on this map is property that is poor repair, distressed, in bad condition. So you can see the impact is major, right at the heart of the city, a huge amount of divestment. Some of you may be familiar with Detroit or St. Louis, places that have had a lot of population decline. This is sort of a similar scale version to that. So what Urban Patch did is to sort of take one little piece of that decline and to do an experiment, really a kind of a pilot project for how that could be improved at a very small scale and a very small budget. So the premise was that in a very close proximity, that's the patch. Urban Patch comes from actually an ecology sort of terminology of urban patch dynamics, which is looking at how ecological systems work in an urban context. And the patch dynamics is sort of the relationship of one element to another as it persists over time. So our first patch was to take three sort of sections: vacant house, a very large vacant lot, which is sort of atypical, but it happens, and then one individual vacant lot, and strategically locate them in proximity and to redevelop them. So this was the vacant house. It was falling down in very bad shape. Very simply, just take it, fix it up, right? So that's one kind of part of the city kind of improved and brought back into service. It's rented out to people at kind of the low income, the existing incomes in that neighborhood. The second was, this was the very large lot. It's 1 acre, so half hectare. And this was done into community gardens, right? So place for people to grow food. As a part of that, and I referenced this earlier, the work that was done back in the 1940s was to not only show people how to grow the food, but then we taught canning classes and cooking classes. So in one of the local churches, we got the programs and training together to have regular classes for people that use the gardens to learn how to can the food. And as you can see, it's a very diverse neighborhood, and so it's something that's meant to promote the people that already live there, and not necessarily for new people or gentrification kind of model. It's really community based. Another project was just simple improvement. So this is a mural project. These are students from the local high school. So young students in art class being able to then take one wall that's on the perimeter of that garden and to improve it as a part of that initiative. And the idea is that you're kind of slowly, very low cost, low budget, transforming that space. And this was the park garden, which was that one kind of single vacant lot that wasn't really doing much, and using, again, people from the neighborhood to improve it. And now it is a garden that is planted with what we call permaculture planting, which is planting that doesn't need to really be maintained, right? Because there isn't a lot of money and time for people to maintain the gardens, but they sort of self-maintain, and these are raspberries, strawberries, cherries, grapes, apple trees, things like that that can be gleaned by people who live in the community. So in order to do all this work, we work with a lot of different stakeholders and players that are all in little ways, small amounts of money, small, 10 hours of volunteer labor here and there, all collected and aggregated into these, what we call patches, little projects in close aggregation that sort of help to make this community better. A big part of that is how we fund projects is through crowdfunding. So this is the online funding. You set up a web page like Kickstarter or something like that, collect small amounts of money, but not only money, but also volunteer time from people or materials that people donate. Like we got field stones from a local farmer to help with the garden. So this is ways that we were able to aggregate the funds. So another part of this urban patchwork is really bringing people together. Again, not us having ideas of what to do with the city, but actually taking the time to talk to people. And this is sort of one of the workshops where we get ideas from people. One idea that people had was taking a bikeway that goes through the neighborhood and doing bicycle-oriented development. So instead of transit-oriented development, train or bus-oriented development, bicycle-oriented development through the community. And so this is a proposal that has now been put into the city's 2020 plan, their kind of future plan for the next 10 years for redevelopment along that bike corridor. So the final project of that I'll show is something called the Indy Redbud Project. A redbud is a type of native tree that grows in Indianapolis. They're very pretty. Looks like this. And again, back to the red and green blotch that sort of is the image of decline in the city. A premise of what you can do as an interim project to improve that is to simply take some of those vacant lots and plant them with these native trees that will improve the urban tree canopy, but also form an identity and beautification project for the city. So again, the idea of an urban project is a different sort of scale, where instead of only thinking about millions of dollars of investment, this is a very simple strategy that helps to transform the image of that community through the simple act of planting a particular species of tree. So this is very common in Washington, D.C. We have cherry blossoms, obviously Japan, similar projects that have been done all over the world. This is translating that idea here to this community in Indianapolis, again, to sort of reinforce the bike corridor, for example, or really to just sort of create a different image for this neighborhood that's associated with crime, poverty, with something else, which is simply to have kind of a different image of that part of the city. And so we started that project. We've already planted about 400 trees, and this is with sort of grant funding, philanthropy money from the city that is paying for this. We're engaging people that actually live in the community to do the planting, and it's something that people get really excited about and helps to make some of those social bonds with neighbors and things that did not really exist before the project. So to end with that section about the urban patch, this is a sort of a statement that was from my grandfather's organization way back in the 40s, and what they call their New Frontier Plan. And it talks something I think is very interesting and important about cities, and it asks a simple question: what is it about? And he says it's about people, about their needs, their abilities. It's about what people know and what they don't know and what they ought to know. And I think it's something that is very important for anyone that's in the business of changing cities. So architects, planners, engineers, whatever, to sort of keep in mind that question, what is all this change that you're doing about ultimately? It's something that we see done very poorly, both in the United States, but especially globally, that people don't kind of keep this very basic question in mind about kind of understanding the role of people and what they really need as their cities are changing and in different stages, right? So, obviously developing city is one thing, but a declining city is something that everyone should also have the tools and interest for. So this is a video clip of some of that work in Indianapolis. And actually New Orleans and Memphis. So these are kind of all typical American cities. So this is really showing like all the different issues and questions that come up. How do people get food? What are the access to jobs? How do you get people to create community? And really the idea of how you translate that into individual action. So, okay, I'm an architect, fine, and architects do big buildings, big projects, but there are also other things that you can do that really help to transform the way that people think about their city and how it can change. So these are all, in this video, images of people that are doing individual projects, like a dance party, right? That's a design project to get people to come to a space and redevelop it. This woman, Naomi, she does bicycle infrastructure, right? So getting bikes through neighborhoods to help people feel safer. Jobs for teenagers. That's my family. Okay, and so then the last section, and this is probably the biggest segment, is now my work in New York City as an urban designer. So you've seen my academic side, my kind of home is where the heart is side, and now this is my professional work. And I've been at city planning in New York for over a decade now, so 10 years of work in a transformation of the city. And I call this section Shape. So really much of the work is shaping kind of how the city transforms. So I'm not directly the architect for any of these projects, but I set the rules for what architects can do or what the developers can do. And so a lot of that work is obviously large-scale design work, but it is work that is at such a big footprint and it takes a long time to do. But again, to dovetail off of the last part of the presentation, in New York there's been a tradition of very large-scale design. Robert Moses controlled development in the city for a very long time, and there was his counterforce, which was Jane Jacobs, who was a big voice in the preservation and community development side. And this is a quote from Jane Jacobs that says that cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because and only when they are created by everybody. And this is something that kind of ethos of people creating the city has really transformed the way that people think about development and design in New York in the recent generations. And so at city planning, we talk about design being focused on quality at all scales. So we work at the scale of the entire city, so where development and density occur, how transportation infrastructure is improved or not, down to the scale of neighborhoods and buildings. So this is the traditional, what I would call the traditional form urban design sort of scale of neighborhood design, master planning, but then urban design at the scale of human experience. So when you have people using the city, what are you actually doing in that transformation of the city? So this is sort of what I call my scope of work professionally in urban design in New York. So this is an image of New York that you all know, sort of lower Manhattan, Brooklyn Bridges, the river, the economy. But I've been working mostly in Brooklyn and Queens, which are really the sort of the fastest growing parts of the city in recent generations, because Manhattan is basically a certain level of saturation. So again, considering context and people, this is New York with Manhattan at the center, Long Island, which is essentially now in a huge suburb, the Hudson Valley that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, and then New Jersey, sort of different state off to the side. But this is that dot density image of New York and kind of what it really means in terms of population, and that it's one of the most diverse places on the globe. Right, so 180 languages spoken, 8.5, close to 9 million people, all in an incredible concentration of development. And what we'll sort of see, so this is Brooklyn. When you kind of take out that section, even Brooklyn, just one borough, one part of the city, has 2.5 million people, right? And so that all, and in a very high density concentration. So it's almost a third of the city in one section. So what's been happening in the past decade is really the transformation of an incredible part of the city, especially along its waterfronts. And this is kind of one section of Brooklyn, so some of you might recognize kind of the shape of Manhattan. But all of these areas along the waterfront have seen a drastic transformation. All the places that are shown in red, labeled in red, were places that were rezoned, where government regulations changed in the past 10 years in that city. But the context for them is really this sort of incredibly rich diversity of places. So brownstone Brooklyn, you may hear about all of the townhome fabric that has become very highly desirable in the city. And you also have places like this. This is the public housing, the social housing in the city, where there's high concentration, very high density, low income, in close proximity. These photos are all within 3 blocks of each other. Industrial places. This is Dumbo, which industry turned into arts and office, high-end residential in Dumbo. So this is a very rich kind of context as well. Again, another 3 blocks away is the Brooklyn Navy Yard. So there's still heavy industry, shipbuilding, and things all happening in close proximity. And that's what makes the place so rich. So what's been happening in the waterfront areas is this post-industrial kind of landscape, old industrial piers, vacant buildings, things like that, that with decline have been transformed into places like this. So parks, green space, new development. And a big part of the discussion has been access to the water. For a very long time, the water was polluted. You couldn't necessarily get into the water and be safe, but that has transformed over time, and now this has become a way for people to really rethink how they live in the city. So this is Brooklyn Bridge Park, where now there were industrial piers and things like that. Now you can do kayaking, recreational boating at the water. Brooklyn Bridge, so this is, again, this former industrial space that we transformed into a park, and so now that's where people go for movies and entertainment. This is a pier that was refashioned into a recreational pier with basketball. There's a soccer pier. There's a tennis pier. So again, this reusing of infrastructure creatively for new purposes of the city is really important. And of course, it's New York. It's a very expensive place, so you can't get away from real estate development. So along with that is the kind of real estate side of things. So this is high-end residential development at John Street. This building pays for all of those park images that you showed, right? So the long-term maintenance and operations of providing that public amenity is paid for by this development, but a lot of the work that we did is sort of developing the design and elements for how the public space and the private space are meant to interface so that there isn't the impression that that park is really for the private development, but that it's more public. So this is kind of an overview image. Again, this is private development, high-end residential. The public zone is all of this that's really the park, and there's an intentional kind of design and development for that interface that allows for people to kind of still have a very public and natural feel to the park, while the park still has the funding to be maintained. Another reference that some of you may know is the High Line, the elevated park in Manhattan uses a very similar structure for its design, and there are similar design controls for that space. So a little further upriver, this is Greenpoint in Williamsburg. So Williamsburg is probably the coolest neighborhood in New York. Artists, hipsters, all of that kind of stuff. But this is really a major chunk of the city, 185 blocks of the city in Brooklyn in very close proximity to Manhattan. So just think, very high value space in Brooklyn right across the river has seen incredible pressure for development. The reason for that was that the area was formerly industrial, and there were significant declines, 60-70% declines in jobs, leaving much of this space to be fallow, like this, vacant, falling apart, this very poor condition of land. At the same time, the upland neighborhoods were seeing a lot of artists and things come in, so the gentrification sort of model. So what we did in this proposal is we went out with people from the neighborhood to ask what they wanted to see as a part of that redevelopment of those 180 blocks of the city. And so this was the first kind of diagram, right, simple idea, which was to provide continuous access along the water. And all of this land along the water was owned by 5 people. So very large tracts of land, completely privately owned land. But as a part of the discussions with the public, was providing for access through all of those private parcels to get a certain grain, a certain scale of development that they felt could relate to their neighborhood, and not necessarily do a different type of development on those waterfront parcels. So my job as designer is to then shape the rules for what we can do. So this is, in the US, private property, corporate ownership is very, very powerful, right? So only thing we could do is sort of make rules to determine what they could do. So what we end up with is this weird patchwork quilt-like map of our zoning regulations that really tailored what people could do on that property in terms of density, uses, and scale of building and development. So example of that is the different kind of zoning boundaries control where buildings could be tall or not. Developer wants the building to be as tall as possible to get the views to Manhattan or to the water. But we sort of design controls that make sure that when you're in the neighborhood that there's a lower scale of development that related to people that live there. Or things like parking, requiring that parking can be provided, but that you can't ever see it from the street, so that the idea of a car-dominated development didn't sort of overwhelm the neighborhood with cars in a place that's meant to be a very walkable, pedestrian-friendly community. The other thing that we're controlling is the social and economic side of things. So through our zoning and density allowances, we control how much affordable housing could be provided. So if a developer wanted more density and taller buildings, they would have to provide housing for lower income people. So in this case, it was 33%, 1/3 of the units would need to be at lower incomes in order to build the tall buildings. So this is something that really was an important social consideration that affected the design ultimately. So the height needed to be traded for some social good. And so this is the development as it's built today. So these building in the foreground, this is low-income housing, so the affordable housing that's built in exchange for being able to do the tower in the back. In addition, the developers had to build out that public space, that green ribbon that I mentioned along the waterfront, and they can do it different amenities like piers and shade structures and parks. But the design of those spaces is really important because a lot of developers will build public space to be very good for their development, like a nice front yard. But what we do is we have sort of control over designing those spaces so that they can be truly public. So this is an aerial view of one of those public spaces that was built. And you can see that it is really, really well used by the public, and all the design elements and features from seating to paving, lighting, green space, etc. are designed to make them as most public as possible instead of only kind of a background for a development. And so this is what that space was before we started, and this is it now in terms of like the public interface, and it's something that has really transformed that neighborhood and that part of the city to be something that accomplishes new public spaces, but also things like affordable housing and balancing development, and it's become a place that truly gets used in a large scale. So this is that section north of the waterfront. So this is what, the government, we changed a rule, right, to sort of say how people could develop, how tall, what kinds of spaces, what nature of the space is there. And so that sets a baseline, right, for development. So in New York, the private market is very powerful, and so they then respond. So this is a site just to the south. So this is what I just showed. This building here, that was the Domino Sugar Factory, so an old sugar plant. The developer bought that plant and wanted to refashion it for a different scale of development. So this is the Domino Sugar proposal, which is a very large-scale development, 3 million square feet, which is, I guess, 280,000 square meters, something like that. And large-scale development, so 55-story buildings on the waterfront. That original, so this huge building is now this little building. So large project, but also providing a significant amount of affordable housing, over 700 units of affordable housing. And the key thing is the transformation of that entirely industrial landscape into something that has a combination of development, public space, and street network extending through the site. So these are kind of ground floor uses. Red is commercial, retail. Blue is school, community uses. So the idea is that even though it's a private development, that it's all activated in a way to make it feel as a more public type of space and environment, including the square and including a waterfront park that is divided by a street so that there's no question about the publicness of that space because it functions as a city park. The design of the buildings, again, these are things that we in the government are controlling. The initial proposals really sort of block the waterfront, maximize views. We transformed some of those things that resulted in these holes, frankly, through the building, so that when you're in the upland neighborhood that there isn't a complete wall blocking you off from the waterfront, but there's still some visual connection so that people know that that waterfront and that park are there. This development is $1.5 billion US in terms of cost. The landscape design, the public space design, is by Field Operations, James Corner. So landscape architect that did the High Line was hired by this developer to do this waterfront space. And so this is the kind of landscape which is very interesting because they took the industrial artifacts from inside the sugar factory. So the silos, the machinery and things are now populated throughout that park as a memory to sort of what was there in the industrial past, but also to create sort of subspaces, sort of a division of different spaces and different uses throughout that park. So it's very interesting. They've just started construction on this now, and everyone's very excited to see this model. But something that's important is that the city set kind of the baseline in the development further north, and the developer then had to do more, right, in order to get approvals. So it's a very high level of design with field operations. Shop is the architect of the buildings, and they had to do more affordable housing to get the project. So the last part is in Queens, so Brooklyn, Queens to the north. This is really a project to build an entirely new neighborhood in New York City. It's very rare. New York is basically built out. Here we had a 30-acre parcel of land. That's Greenpoint is here, the north of Brooklyn is here, Midtown Manhattan is just across the river. So a 30-acre parcel of land under complete public control, also very rare. And this is sort of where it's situated in the city. So, Times Square, Grand Central Station, Central Park, very close proximity, sort of in the heart of the New York metro region. The impetus for this project was at this section, that is Peter Cooper Village in Stuyvesant Town, which this is the largest affordable housing block in New York City. In 2005, it was sold to a private company and was going to lose its status as affordable housing. So for New York, it was a major issue that the city was losing its affordable housing, and the developers said to the city, if you give us, I forget how many billions of dollars it is, that they would keep it affordable, and the city said, never mind, we'll build our own housing here. So that's the project. So the design of this project is based not on really anything that architects, landscape architects traditionally think of. This was the scope of work for this project. So these are income bands in New York City, from 80% AMI, so people that make $40,000 a year, up to people that make about $160,000 a year. So everything in this project was done to follow those income bands of housing. So people that make below that typically can live in public housing and social housing. People who make above that can typically afford market rate. But there is very, very little housing produced in New York City in this middle range of what they call kind of workforce or affordable housing. So this is the basis, and then this is what we had to work with, which is just this piece of fallow property that was controlled by the state. It used to be kind of logistics, shipping, newspaper, and stuff. So what gets plugged into that project as the origin of the design is something like this, which is a spreadsheet of square footages, affordability levels, construction costs for different building types. So in the US, there's something called block and plank construction, which goes up to 13 stories. It's union labor you don't have to use to build block and plank, so the construction cost is very low. And then the tower construction cost is something else entirely, and you do have to use union labor. So those parameters are sort of going into an equation that says this much housing at X affordability rate, this much building, this much footprint at X construction costs, right? So that's the parameters controlling the design of this development. At the same time as there's another control, which is the cost of new infrastructure for streets, parks, open space, etc. So these are kind of put into a model, and different kind of schemes come out. Ultimately, one was selected that basically had roughly 1/3 of the space as park, so 10 acres as park, 3 acres as infrastructure, 7 acres as development parcel, that were balanced so that there was enough block and plank, low construction costs balanced with the higher construction costs of tower, to accomplish the goal of building a new neighborhood in New York that could actually be affordable to people, right? So it's not the best thing that you would design in terms of the best public space or the best building, but it's designed based on those parameters. So this is kind of what we had as a concept with the park, the development parcels, that were put into design controls for how the buildings get put together, and then ultimately sort of a vision project, and then these were the types of developments that we got out of that. Again, I think this is shop again, the development of these towers that are meant to integrate into these sort of lower scale, lower construction costs buildings. And again, the shape of the towers, all of that is based on unit size, so having more family units, things like that are actually highly important in controlling the design and development of these urban forms, so that you don't have a developer will build all studios in one-bedroom apartments, because that's where they get the most profit, right? So we have to design our regulations to ensure that we can get housing that suits the lower incomes that typically have families that need 2- and 3-bedroom apartments. So these are all design controls. The next important thing in this project was all of the different urban systems that were as a part of this site. So this little thing, that's the power core that feeds Manhattan, right? So there are constraints and things that were being designed around for the site overall, but also thinking about the ecology of the waterfront and the development of those spaces to create unique park experiences for this new population. It was about 5,000 units total, so 15,000 people is what this neighborhood is meant to control. So whole new neighborhood, 15,000 people in the city. This is a kind of a sort of technical drawing, but these are all the negotiations of things of infrastructure that need to be related for tunnels, power, new sewers, all of that is sort of put together and to create an experience of the place. A new school is also a part of the project. So this is it built. The city built the park and the infrastructure. The developments were done by private development, but again, at low income, this first tower that went up was actually 100% affordable housing. So at those income ranges. That's the new school that was built, the new park. And something that's interesting about the park is that this sort of section is turf. This section is real grass because the number of people that were using it needed to be turf for the high function of use. But really the idea was that this neighborhood, again, a completely new neighborhood in New York City, had the public spaces, had the scale development, had the services to create a place that people would truly use as public. And, the human experience, again, is something that we always try to promote in our work, and that, when we're building this part of the city, that there needs to be people that are responsible for understanding that is a critical part for how things are put together. So when you're in this development in this new park, this is sort of the view that you get when you come out of your apartment and go walk your dog or whatever. This canopy sort of sweeps through the whole park. It has solar panels that feed the light for the park, but these are kind of the conditions that it allows. So I have one last video. And this is someone who lives near the development, and they photographed the development of this neighborhood, kind of time-lapse over time, so you can see the park and its development. UN building. The views from this waterfront are obviously very nice. So here's the turf field, the real lawn. Here you see all that infrastructure. And something that was very critical when we were designing this project was all the infrastructure work was being borne by the city. And this was pre-Hurricane Sandy. And we actually fought very early on to have the grades raised to be 3 feet higher than what were in the current flood elevations. After Hurricane Sandy, there was a lot of destruction in New York City from the storm surges, and the federal government then raised their flood elevation 2 feet. So we were 1 foot extra. But this whole park that was done and rebuilt, the lawn got inundated during the storm, but there was basically no damage. So the advanced planning and thinking about the infrastructure was really key. Another thing we fought for was that bike lane that sort of connects that whole neighborhood through to the waterfront, and bringing that in as an initial thing and not an afterthought was also very difficult because it took away from development footprint. So it's a lot of different negotiations that come into kind of putting together the city. And here you really see the transformation. And it's sort of a silly thing, but the New York fireworks, the 4th of July fireworks, were now launched from this park instead of Brooklyn Bridge or the UN or Hudson River Park. So it was sort of a recognition that this whole new neighborhood that we created is now truly a sort of important part of New York City. So this section that's here is the sort of the phase 2 of the project, and that's going into construction in the spring. So that is it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Justin.
Yes.
Amazing presentation. I have also to say thank you to the collaborators that I have here. It's Carlos, Saúl, and Jorge that they have organized this recording in YouTube and in streaming. Anyway, we will have all this at the end of this month when we are going to celebrate the Playtex. Anyway, do not escape. If there is any questions in English or in Español, please go ahead because Justin is really affordable.
Yeah.
You can ask whatever you want.
Yeah, anything.
Podéis preguntar lo que queráis y si queréis hacerlo en español, pues lo traducimos. ¿Alguna pregunta? We don't have a micro.
I think I can do it. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Right. I think you might be in a perfect position as a New York City planner to comment on the following questions. Well, it's really 2.5 questions. Mm-hmm. One is there a consensus about the figure of Moses within the New York City planner community, if there be such a thing? Mm-hmm. I don't know whether there is such a thing. Second, would there be a similar consensus regarding the pressures of gentrification within New York City development. And relating to that last question, you seem to, you keep saying that the real estate industry in New York is tremendously powerful, yet you seem to be able to tell them that they have to build 30% at least, a third of their development is going to be affordable development.
Right.
And then you say that in the John Street, was it John Street development?
Right.
That in fact the building is paying for public amenities. How do you do that? What kind of leverage do you have to accomplish that?
Right. So a couple of things. So the Jones, Robert Moses, right? So I think people accept that Robert Moses did important things for the city in terms of infrastructure that we to this day rely on, roads, parks, etc. I think most people think the way that it was done was the worst thing ever. And it actually has, in a way, crippled the potential for big picture planning and development in New York and much of the U.S. sort of forever. A lot of the things that Moses did are now politically impossible to do, right? So land clearance, taking property, etc., those are basically outside of the toolkit for development. So it's created a situation where there's a bit of a problem when you really need to do major infrastructure. So I mentioned Hurricane Sandy and all of the work that's needed for rebuilding those parts of the city need the kind of Robert Moses approach, but we can't use it. It's done. So people, I think, in the planning and development world recognize that is necessary sometimes. That type of thinking and planning, construction are needed, but it's, for a lot of reasons, they don't do it and won't do it. The real estate industry and gentrification kind of pole is, I think, very much a problem for the city and the administration of the city, because the real estate has a lobby, right? They have people that effectively control who gets into power in government. Much of the work I showed you was from the last 10 years or so of development in New York City. During that time, we had Mayor Bloomberg, who was a billionaire, independently wealthy. No one really controlled him, right? Because he was just that rich. And so the real estate lobby, he was friendly with the real estate lobby because he's, frankly, a rich white guy. But they didn't have total control. The new administration is more, I would say, left-leaning, Democrat, progressive government, but there is actually probably more control of the real estate lobby on that administration. And so what they've done in the politics now of affordable housing is to basically come to an agreement about what is possible for development. So now real estate prices have gone through the roof. A lot of that is foreign money, Russia, China. EB-5 is a financing program where basically people in Asia can give millions of dollars and they just get a visa, right? And it's providing a lot of funding, but it's providing also this dynamic of development that just promotes a lot of speculative real estate. But what the government has been able to do is to say, okay, well, there's so much value that's created every time we increase the zoning, change the zoning, that we can take a third of that. So basically what's happening is we're giving you enough value that's 5 times what you're getting, but we're going to take 3, right? And so there is a negotiation there, and there's I think within the real estate industry, there's an acceptance of that as being the cost of business, right? So New York density is relatively high, but we're pushing the envelope on density. So places where in the last administration we would have done 5 FAR, maybe 8 FAR of density, now is saying you're required to do the affordable housing. We're talking about 10, 15, 18 FAR. So there, it's a negotiation, and everything is negotiable, right? And the development community is starting to say, fine, we'll build your affordable housing, but we need X in terms of density. It's a big open question about what that means in terms of infrastructure. When we're building more and more and more, is there truly the capacity for that, and is enough money being put in to development? And so something that's good that has happened in this last administration is that the planning department now has control of a capital budget for things like infrastructure, schools, sewers, parks that it can deploy along with these increases in development. So again, if you're a private developer, they always say we already counted our money. As long as what change that you require of them doesn't mean that they lose money on their sheet, then it's something they're willing to do.
Other questions?
Or just about New York? I'm not sure you have questions about New York.
Well, I can finish with something very, very simple. I saw the change of New York after September 11th. The zoning I see nowadays really much more thinner and higher skyscrapers in Manhattan, and also all the problem with the Sandy is bringing new designs of ecological protection and landscape approach, like the BU or the project that you're working on. What is your, let's say, prediction? Because we are seeing nowadays all these changes. What are your predictions for the future changes of New York and even the region?
Something that is really incredible, just in 10 years is seeing how much the city is transformed. I mean, the super talls that you're talking about, the skyscrapers that are very, very thin and 1,000 feet tall, where they're transferring development rights over into these very skinny buildings, is now even happening not only in the core of Manhattan but all over the city. So I think, I was alluding to before, the notion of what is high density has been changed in New York in the past 10 years. It's really incredible to see kind of the impact of that, and to the degree that these tall buildings, they cast shadows. They're so tall they cast shadows on Central Park, right? And so there's this sort of, I think, big battle over public space that I think is going to be really important to look at in the next sort of 10 years. Some of you've probably heard of Highline, but also Times Square, sort of the tourist center of New York, was changed to be space for cars to being space for people, right? And that kind of recognition that the actual infrastructure and design of these spaces of the city need to be reconsidered is really, I think, something that everyone is now figuring out. And I think it is going to be a more and more acceptance that we need more density because people are still having babies, right? And that kind of recognition is really important. And I think in the US, at least, there is an incredibly urban-centric demographic shift, like a major change. There was a 50-year period where cities were not good, essentially, right? And that kind of mindset shift, anyone that is sort of 40 and under, and that pattern seems to be continuing with the younger and younger generations, means that the value of the city is very high, which brings the real estate pressures. It brings sort of these questions about cost. And so in New York, there is there's just a limit. You know, an average apartment, not even a nice one, in Manhattan is $1 million. Actually, $1.3 million to get an apartment. You know, average monthly rent for a regular, not a nice apartment, just a regular apartment is $3,000 a month. Right? That is a product of this major demographic shift for privileging cities in terms of your decision making of where you live. Right? And so the city is trying to the degree it can to provide the spaces like new waterfront parks, like making Times Square for pedestrians, like the High Line. But there's only so much that can be done, and there's people are starting to think about where else people need to go, right? So New York, global city, you can't control all of that. Well, maybe Detroit is a good place for some people to live, or maybe, you know, Newburgh and Beacon, places very close to New York City, are good places to live, and what is needed to happen there to get development to balance out the cost. But that's the sort of the gentrification debate is very, very fever pitch in New York because the costs are so extreme. And in New York, we build a lot, these huge towers. It looks like you're building a lot. It's a drop in the bucket compared to the entire real estate market. You can build thousands and thousands of units, and it doesn't affect supply and demand at all, right? So I think that's the big challenge, and the cost of these tall, skinny things are for billionaires, right? It's not affecting most of the people that live in the city. But I think that play of accepting that cities are attractive and figuring out how do we create more of that product, right? Density, mix of uses, activity, parks, and more types of places so that the whole thing can function better is really the next step.
Okay. We can close.
Great.
Justin, thank you very much.
Yes,
And
thank all of you.
also the professors and students that have just come here, Yokwama and Chencho and Noro, and all the professors that have bring here all their students.
Great.
Anyway, thank you very much, Justin.
Yes.
To close here.
Thank you.